Dis maandag aand en dis tyd vir 'n gesprek. Goeienaand en welkom. Vanaand bespreek ons 'n aanval op parlementslede in die Wes-Kaap. Ek hoor by die voorsitter van die parlementêre komitee van openbare rekeninge waarom behoorlike oorsig sloer en ons vra waarom daar nog nie jagkwotas vir olifante en renosters gepubliseer is nie. Ons begin met 'n nuwe boek wat na verwagting groot opslag gaan maak. Babita Deokaran was 'n fluitjieblaser wat te veel geweet het. En voor sy vermoor is, het sy kommer uitgespreek oor korrupsie op regeringsvlak en die feit dat haar lewe in gevaar is. In The Shadow State, Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die, vertel die bekroonde ondersoekende joernalis Jeff Wicks 'n verhaal van korrupsie, staatskaping en polisiemislukkings wat jou nekhare laat rys. Hy sit hier oorkant my. Jeff, congratulations on the book. I know it came after years of hard work and you getting stuck in the trenches of this story. A central theme is how this case actually fell apart after the Hawks took over the investigation. What were some of their biggest blunders?
Well, Lourensa, thank you for having me and thank you for letting me speak about this. It's a pivotally important story. And, you know, it's part of the betrayal of Babita Deokaran, as to why she was betrayed after her death. And that came in the way the police handled the case. And there were successes early on with the arrest of 6 hitmen, men who have now been convicted and sentenced. But after that, the case slowed and nearly ground to a complete halt. And through our work at News 24, what we were able to do was actually prove that Babita Deokaran's laptop and cell phone, which were seized as evidence by the police on the day of her murder, were never actually forensically examined. The Hawks deny that this misstep occurred, but the reality is we have a digital fingerprint that is left behind whenever people go near a device to forensically analyze it, and that is not present on Babita's devices.
To what lengths, I mean, you write about this in the book, it's such an interesting chapter, but you went to great lengths to get access to this laptop and cell phone. Tell us about that.
We were convinced that those devices would hold the answers. You know, we were trying to answer the question why she had to die and exactly what the motive could have been for her murder. And it took us several months, but once we got a hold of those devices, it really broke the story open. I mean, when we got access to her emails, we found the report that she'd filed 3 weeks before she was killed, wherein she set out her concerns about what was happening at Tembisa Hospital and appended a list of companies that she felt deserved further scrutiny. She raised these concerns directly with her boss, Lourensa at the Gauteng Health Department, and even followed it up with WhatsApp messages and phone calls, and she was ostensibly ignored. She was murdered, and then the report that she'd filed was just ferreted away, and it never saw the light of day again. And the payments that she'd frozen, 100 million rand in money that was about to rush out of Gauteng Health's coffers, was unfrozen and let loose.
So you also write about this in the book about how when those 6 hitmen, I mean, they were arrested, they were then convicted, they entered into a plea agreement, but there was a celebratory mood in court when they were sentenced, like they'd somehow gotten away with something. Is that because we still don't know who the real masterminds are?
I believe so, and I think that's where the Deokaran family deserves real justice. The fact of the matter is, those hitmen are izinkabi, you know, assassins from the minibus taxi industry who move from one job to another. They had no real sense of who Babita Deokaran was, and they certainly didn't hire themselves. I think the sting for the Deokaran family, and it has dire ramifications for all whistleblowers in the country, is that it's now been nearly 1,500 days, and the mastermind who ordered the hit on Babita still breathes free air. And that's the greatest failing of the police in this entire saga.
But one core component of the shadow state is this industry of hitmen, you know, killers, assassins for hire. In the book you write about, you know, a travel excursion that you take to Vienna in KwaZulu-Natal, which is basically a town where these hitmen come from mostly, right?
Absolutely. It's this tiny village outside of Vienna called Inhlawe. And we went there on a total hunch trying to track down these men and try and understand exactly who they were and what their connections were. And it was something of a lark in terms of journalism because we only had one word to go on, but we knew how important the story was. So we got in the car and we went there. And what we found was that all of these hitmen, bar one, all came from the same small village. If you stood in the in the lowest dip of the valley, you could literally turn on a circle and see all of their homesteads along the hillsides. So they were all connected from childhood, and then they all moved to the reef here, where they became embroiled in the minibus taxi industry and then ended up becoming contract killers.
And Jeff, those senior ANC politicians that are somehow linked to this whole case, tell us a bit more about that.
Well, so many, at so many junctures during our investigation, the money flows and the patronage lines flowed back to the ANC. One such example is Selo Sokoko, who's in a position of leadership in the East Rand. He had 3 companies doing simultaneous trade with Tembisa Hospital, and he vastly inflated prices. And you know, this is a politician who should espouse the values of the party, upliftment of the poor. And when you're charging with several 100% markup on some of your products, it kind of flies in the face of that. But one of the major players at Tembisa Hospital, one of the syndicate bosses that not only we identified, but the SIU has confirmed, is Morgan Mamela. And he has a familial trace back to President Cyril Ramaphosa, albeit very distant. And to be fair to the president, he said he has no knowledge of this man and does not know him, but they are related. And so constantly, as we sort of peel back the layers of the story and try to understand exactly who was benefiting, it kept taking us back to the then governing party.
And a central figure, of course, is Kat Matlala. We've spoken about him on this program before. Today he revealed his ties with former police minister Bheki Cele.
Yes, and he was a central figure then, and we had identified him as part of a larger syndicate that was operating at Tembisa Hospital. But we knew then that he was a person who would be deserving of more focus at some point, and it proved prescient almost now that he's such a focal point in our news. It also speaks to the patent lack of accountability. So Babita Deokaran was the first person to ever identify Kat Matlala. It's only through her that we know who he is, because her list of companies that she identified, we traced 3 back to him, and we were able to write about that. Now, whilst he was under investigation for procurement fraud by both the SIU and the Hawks, he wins a 360 million rand tender from the police. So it speaks volumes about the amount of due diligence that was done. And the red flags are raised in abundance. And, you know, we've yet to see a successful prosecution for corruption in terms of what Babita found, and we're now 4 years on from her death.
Jeff, what are some of the lengths that you've had to go to ensure your own safety? I mean, you just spoke about these cold-blooded killers and how easy it is to take a life in this country. I mean, it certainly happened to Babita. Were there ever times where you were afraid during this investigation, during the process of writing this book? Absolutely.
I mean, I was afraid a lot, and following this story has changed my life dramatically. You know, when we found the report that she'd filed, we had a fairly good assurance then that that was a document that got her killed. And when we had that document, we inherited that danger. And so that was the thought process at the time, that we needed to be hyper-aware and hyper-vigilant. And in the way that it's changed my life, I remain hyper-aware and hyper-vigilant, because, you know, the difference between myself and Babita Deokaran is that she was caught by surprise. I will try not to be caught by surprise. And we understand that we tread a dangerous path, but it remains too important a story not to tell.
I mean, you say in the book that this is one of the reasons that you're doing this is to ensure justice for her and also her family, who you've worked with closely since her death, since her murder. Why is it important to keep her name and her legacy alive?
I think it's because of what she represents. You know, I don't think she set out to be a whistleblower. I think she was just a good civil servant who had service at the core of what she did. And she blew the whistle or raised a flag because she could see that something was amiss and money was being misspent and extracted. Now, when there's a lack of accountability for those who perpetrated her murder, it sends a message to every other whistleblower that even if you take your life in your hands, risking your job and your family's lives and then your own life, that if you're murdered, the police will likely never solve your case. And we can't afford for that message to perpetuate, because it's a cost that we'll never be able to measure, of how many people did not come forward when they saw something was amiss and they could have said something, but they were fearful.
Jeff, these networks, these patronage networks, or rather procurement networks that made all of this possible at the Department of Health in Gauteng, is it still in place, or have steps been taken to make sure that this never happens again?
Well, you know, from what we understand, there have been moderate steps to try and meter this, but this is not a story about Tembisa Hospital alone. During our investigation, we found at least 5 hospitals where these procurement networks had taken root. And then there's payments from the Department of Education, from the Department of Social Development. So, you know, Babita found a leviathan of extraction at one medical facility, and those networks managed to pull out 2.3 billion rand in 2 years. We know that it's bigger than that. And that's why this case is so important, because Babita saw the first shades of this thing, and I don't think that we've yet to really understand its true scale.
Jeff, thank you so much, and thank you for this important book that you've written.
Thank you.